Thank you, Annie. Thank you to Rebecca Miller, and thank you to the American Jewish Historical Society for having us all here tonight, and thank you everyone for coming. It's a pretty gloomy evening, but not for us, because we are here to explore a rich and really interesting subject, and that is Jewish labor in the early 20th century in New York City, intersections and tensions. So I just want to make a few framing comments, let you know what our plan is for the conversation, but it is completely unscripted, and then we'll get started. So if you know about Jewish labor history in the first half of the 20th century, you likely know a few kind of standout events, and those would be in no particular order of importance, just chronologically, the 1909 uprising of the 20,000, that strike of women shirtwaist workers. The 1910 Great Revolt, another strike of about 60,000, mostly male cloak workers. The 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. The rise of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union. And then the formation of industrial unions under the CIO in the 1930s. Well, tonight we're going to open up that story a little bit. We're going to navigate this familiar terrain, but we're also going to move into other, perhaps lesser known areas. And we're going to mix things up a little bit, maybe challenge some preconceptions, experiment with some new ideas. And we hope you enjoy the ride. So I've got seated to my left a stellar panel, and I'm going to introduce them all to you now. Right to my immediate left is Cameron Black. He's an assistant professor of labor studies at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. Next to Cameron is Alice Kessler-Harris, the R. Gordon Hoxie Professor Emerita of American History in honor of Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Professor Emerita in the Institute for Research on Women and Gender, both at Columbia University. And Tejasvi Nagaraja, he is Assistant Professor of Labor History, Global Labor, and Work at Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations. And last but definitely not least, Danny Walkowitz, Professor Emeritus of Social and Cultural Analysis and Professor Emeritus of History at New York University. And I am Mary Anne Trasciatti, and I have one piece of information, or one order of business before we get started. I just want to remind you to write any questions that occur to you during the conversation on the piece of paper that you were given when you came in, so that when the time comes, you'll have them ready to submit to the staff, and they'll give them to me. So without further ado, let's get the conversation started. So the first question I want to pitch to the panel, and this is for anyone to take, is what's the period that we're actually talking about here? So let's start with time. What are we talking about?
If I had my druthers, I'd say we're talking about the mid-1890s, or perhaps I'll make it 1890 to World War II. And I'd stop at World War II because I think after the 30s, the shape of the labor movement is quite different from the earlier period.
Okay. Anybody else?
Well, I would probably start at a few years earlier than that. Thinking about probably around 1886, thinking of Gompers with the AFL and the participation of Jews in the Haymarket, and then take the story into the 90s with the United Hebrew Trades, et cetera.
Okay, so different beginnings, same end.
The other point I guess I just would make is that stepping back into the 80s allows us to think a little bit about the role of some of the German Jewish Marxists, as well as the Russian Jews coming together, Russian Jewish intellectuals coming together in the formation of the Jewish labor movement, at least beginning to intellectualize and form that kind of formation.
Okay, does that work for you too?
I would probably suggest pushing the time period a little bit later. to about the 1950s. See, this is what happens when you ask historians about time. We're quite devious at dancing around. But I think the ending in 1950 sort of adds, I think, a couple of different dimensions in how we think about different alliances that World War II sort of helped engender, but also different ways that the war also ripped apart certain alliances as well. So 1950, I would say, is a pretty decent ending point, but the 1880s, I would see it on a good starting point.
So could I add another? Tej, do you want to say something, or should?
You go first, then I'll jump in. Yeah.
I wanted to say that where we start and end depends on how we're defining the Jewish labor movement. And if we're really talking about, if we're talking about Jews in the labor movement, then I'd say we can start where Danny wants to start. But if we're talking about a Jewish labor movement, that is, we're talking about the United Hebrew Trades, we're talking about Jewish workers organizing as Jews as opposed to organizing as workers of any denomination and so on, then I think we do have to start a little later. And the Bund gets organized in 1897, I think, if I'm remembering that date right, but it's the late 1890s. The United Hebrew Trades, the ILG, which is the International Labor's Garment Workers, in 1900. So let's decide what we're talking about, I guess.
Are we going to have 4 historians, 5 opinions, or?
No, I'm agreeable. I mean, I think we can, just for the chronology, right? I mean, some of the audience may be familiar, and some might be piecing it together. I think thinking of the 1880s as formative for a sort of moderate unionism like the AFL, as well as sort of a radical movement associated with Haymarket, and maybe a first Red Scare in that sort of 1886 Haymarket moment in response to a perceived foreign radicalism. And then the way that successive German Jewish and German Jewish migrants shape the pre-1900 labor movement. And then I think you do need that sort of 1905 moment of the Bund and the link between the Russian Empire and the United States, right? Creating another generation of both migration and a new kind of politics, the sort of Yiddish and Bund generation that is a little bit different than that earlier German Jewish vision after 1905. And then I think we have to talk about World War I and the crisis and repression of the post-war era of 1919 through the 1920s. And then we can think of a long World War II from the mid-1930s to the 1950s, where the crisis of fascism sort of echoes globally and domestically. And for US labor, for Jewish Americans, Black Americans, and others, World War II and a struggle against global racism and US racism is already crystallizing by the mid-1930s with the Popular Front through the World War II years, and then with a second Red Scare in that period. So we can think of a 1886 Red Scare, a 1919 Red Scare, and then a 1947 Red Scare, reshaping labor's horizons, but also Jewish and labor identity.
There we go. So we're done.
Great.
I like the Red Scare.
And I agree with all of your periodizations.
Yeah. So we're punctuating. We're punctuating this with Red Scares, not to mention the little Red Scares.
Yes, of course.
Right in the middle. So let's take up Alice's point. What are we talking about, or who are we talking about here, right? Are we talking about a Jewish labor movement? Are we talking about the Jewish working class? So what is it actually that we're talking about?
So I'm glad you asked that question, because I'm going to dig my heels in a bit.
Here you go.
It does seem to me that, speaking now as a historian who likes specificity, right? What are we actually looking at? The Jewish labor movement, I would define as a movement of basically Eastern, some Central, but mostly Eastern European immigrants who came to the US in the 1880s, the 1890s, and the early 1900s and revolted against the poor working conditions that they found here. I think that group is distinct from the German workers who, some of whom organized before, but when they organized, they were craft workers, as opposed to the, relatively speaking, I know we use the word unskilled, and I deplore that word because they were quite skilled workers, the women as well as the men, but they were counted as unskilled workers. And I identify that Jewish labor movement as a secular labor movement. It does not, for the most part, have a religious origin, but it is deeply rooted in Russian, I don't want to call it socialism, but perhaps I should call it socialism, but it's Russian radicalism, certainly, of various kinds, including anarchism in the 1880s and 90s. So though it's rooted there, that's brought with them. I define the labor movement as, I know everybody's going to disagree with this, but I would define it, at least initially, as New York-based. And most of us, when we say the Jewish labor movement, we're thinking about the Lower East Side in New York, beginning in that period of, you could start in the 1880s. That migration doesn't begin until the early 1880s, but really concentrated in the early years of the 20th century. And you could watch that labor movement disintegrate into a different kind of labor movement that I would no longer call a Jewish labor movement in the 1930s and 1940s. So that's my heels dug in.
Right.
Definition.
Responses, alternative answers?
Well, I just would add that not all the garment workers were Jewish. Even 80% or so are estimated to be so. But there were others, so that becomes a matter of the Jews in the labor movement rather than a Jewish labor movement. So it's worth at least thinking a little bit about what's the Jewish character of that labor movement and how do the Jews give it a particular kind of shape and what kind of contribution do they make. I think 1905 is a good point if you're thinking about the history of the Bund, but there seems to be enough evidence that the Bundists are here before that, and they're the ones who are real. The women involved in the kosher meat riot are, in fact, thought to be Bundists as well, and that's before 1905. So it's a little hard to be fixed dates with all of this. But certainly, I think, as the turn into the chronological 20th century, we're actually talking about a long 20th century otherwise, but the turn into the actual 20th century, I think, is correct in terms of the changing character of whatever that labor movement had been. Indeed, it isn't a story any longer of German Jews particularly at all. It's Eastern European Jews. I think I'm always interested in the fact that they're Russians. A lot of people will say to me, my parents came from Russia, and I always say, oh, yes, where? And they say, oh, Warsaw. Well, of course, they're right, the Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Warsaw is part of the Russian Empire, but it's Poland. Right. And a lot of these people are really part of a Eastern European, rather than Russian per se, heritage for all of this. So that's just quibbling a little bit, but it's useful because people like to think of these as all Russian Jews when they're not quite Russian Jews. They're really mostly Polish Jews now, at least in terms of the story. And even Polish Jews who now are in historically Ukraine, where my grandfather always told me he was Austrian because it was the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, but he was from Lviv in what is now Ukraine. So these boundaries and the terms are complicated.
On the other hand, my family came from Hungary, they always thought of themselves as Central Europeans,
Right.
and they would have withdrawn if you had accused them of being Eastern Europeans. Those were the hoi polloi, not the...
Well, that's part of the
So-
story about who are the Jews in this story, because after all, not all Jews joined the labor movement. It's worth remembering that the people running these factories, in some cases, are Jews. Think of the, again, Triangle Shirtwaist Fire story. Who's running these factories?
So it is, I don't know whether we should go there yet, but it is actually one of the most interesting things to me that the people who the Jews are rebelling against in the early 1900s, in that famous 1909 strike, in the 1902 women's
Kosher meat boycott.
kosher meat, thank you, the kosher meat boycott and so on, are like themselves Eastern European Jews or Central European Jews. In other words, they are not, for the most part, there are a few German Jews in there owning the businesses, but for the most part, the garment shops, the early sweatshops, and the later small factories like Triangle were owned by people who were either themselves immigrants from Eastern Europe. So the Jewish labor movement it's an internal fight, if you like, in those early years among Jews, in those early years in New York City. I'm leaving Baltimore a little out of it because there the German Jews are more active, and Philadelphia is also Eastern European, but Boston is not. So, but in New York City, where the heart of the Jewish labor movement is. So I think the thing to remember, though, is that literally half of the 2.5 million Jews who emigrate to the US between 1880 and 1914 end up living in New York City. And of that half, more than half earn their livings at some point or another, not for their entire lives, but at some point or another in the garment industry. So when the garment industry organizes, even though it's absolutely correct to say that Italians they're probably less than 20% of the workers in the industry in the early 1900s, and they are probably less than 10% of those who initially organize. But the union goes out of its way. It's a Jewish union speaking Yiddish, a Yiddish-speaking Jewish union that goes out of its way to organize Italians. It's still a Jewish labor movement, even though it's organizing Italians, and even though one of the ironic things about the movement at that time is that it explicitly excludes Asians. It doesn't want Japanese and Chinese workers in the unions, but it does admit black people. It admits African Americans. There aren't very many in the industry in the early years, but the number grows increasingly into the 20s and the 30s. And even when they do that, it's still it's a Jewish labor movement. Its core, its heart, its ideology is all rooted in a Jewish secular tradition. So that's why I'm digging my heels in here and saying, yes, bravo to the Haymarket strikers, but they're not, I don't call that a part of the Jewish labor movement.
It's about roots, not about the Jewish labor movement in the 20th century, for sure. I mean, I think you're totally right. I wouldn't have any questions about that. But I would talk a little bit about the Jewish labor movement and where that ideology is coming from, because the socialists and communists play a major role in that, and they're often at each other's throat in the story. But it's the communists on the whole that play a very strong role in at least trying to think about the role of women and of African Americans more than the others.
To add on, I think your point about sort of living under the Russian Empire, I don't think that's a quibble. Like, I think that's like a really important part of this story, right? Like, the Russian Empire was sprawling. It was gargantuan. We're talking about a space that had something like 12, 13 time zones, right? Over 110 listed different ethnicities, right? Like a massive multi-ethnic state. And these, and Russian Jews who attempted to organize in New York City, I think, took these diasporic experiences into different, into labor organizing, in a sense that attempting to organize African Americans, Italians, what was not as, I would say, unfamiliar because of their experiences in the Russian Empire. Though that is to say, if we look further west into, say, Los Angeles and New York City, this experience does become a little bit more complicated. There a lot of prominent Jewish politicians in San Francisco, for instance, did support the Chinese Exclusion Act, which would sort of boomerang around in 1924. But I think their experiences as diasporic refugees is really important to understanding these different sort of multicultural unions, or as some historians would argue, social unionism.
Tej, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing as our conversation plays out is and this is a crude way to put it, but maybe a useful framing, is that when we're in the 1900s, the first decade of the 20th century, the Jewish, intra-Jewish character is more acute. And as we go along in time, both geographically and relationally with other groups, to the 1910s, to the 20s, to the 30s, that's going to become more relationally dynamic. I think it's worth naming explicitly a wider context, right? That this is a singular moment in American history where whole industries at the peak of the Second Industrial Revolution rely primarily, majority, on immediately immigrating workers, such that workers already in the country, white, black, or otherwise, are not the majority workers in a range of sectors in New York City and elsewhere, but these Jewish and Italian other immigrants constitute the majority at this turn of the century moment. And there's a particular character to the Russian Empire Jewish migrants that can be compared only to maybe the Finnish experience, which is that there is a socialist hegemony, there is a socialist leadership. That doesn't mean all the individual Jewish workers were socialists, but it means that there was a socialist common sense and idiom to this Jewish labor movement, such that both non-Yiddish and as the sort of Yiddish character gains ground, there is that hegemony. And so that also is another layer that is distinct for the Jewish experience and perhaps the Finnish experience in the Great Lakes region that is different from Italians or other groups in this period. And that also shapes that kind of intersection. But the only thing I would add is that as we get very soon after that 1909 moment and into the 1910s, there are also relational experiences with other groups. In this garment industry in the 1900s, it is a class struggle within that Jewish community, that cross-class Jewish community that has come wholesale in their 2 million and their 1 million and their 500,000, as you said, in this remarkable sort of transportation of cross-class relations. It is a class struggle within that Jewish community. But there is those relations with, as you said, with Italian workers. And while it's sometimes less significant than in ILGWU or the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Association, there are Jewish workers and Jewish activists in the industrial workers of the world in the early to mid 1910s. They're not often the most prominent ethnicities associated with the more radical IWW. We think of Italian workers, we think of some of the the northern Scandinavian workers, but that you do have Jewish activists. You do have Matilda Rabinowitz, who comes and organizes, staff organizer, woman staff organizer for the IWW in the New York State region, and also goes into the Midwest across clothing industry, even tries to get a foothold in Ford. And you do have other figures, I jotted this down, like Frank Tannenbaum, who's also a Jewish organizer in the IWW in New York City, organizing unemployed workers for relief, organizing incarcerated people in that mid-1910s moment. So there are these interethnic relations, and in the major IWW strikes, of course, Paterson, New Jersey, which is very much part of the New York City metropolitan area, as well as Lawrence, Massachusetts, you do have these relations amongst Italians, Jews, and others. So it's worth appreciating that, because that's in the same half decade, the 1909 to 1913, as the Triangle Shirtwaist.
And of course, Paterson is particularly appropriate as a New York story because the Paterson pageant is brought back to Madison Square Garden. The organizers are coming out of New York to help and support that strike. It also helps us remember that it isn't just the garment industry, it's the needle trades. And in places like Paterson and Passaic, you're dealing with people in the textile industry. And the textile industry was much more both Jewish and Italian than the garment industry was. That's where the Italians were an equal part. And I know there was a lot of, there's been some good history and oral history done about those strikes. And there was a good deal of struggle between the two groups that often had quite different kinds of interests, and a lot of hard work that went into by the organizers to create solidarities amongst those peoples.
So maybe that's a nice segue, because we are committed to the topic of intersections and tensions. So maybe we might want to delve into that, and particularly around solidarity, right, which is an important, not just an idea, but an important lived reality when you're organizing and striking and picketing. And so let's talk about that. Tell me, let's dig into the relations between the Jewish community or communities or the Jewish labor movement and other ethnic and cultural populations. And I'm wondering here too, I'm thinking about the relations, for example, between Jews and Italians, and where does language fit in, right? How do you organize this multi-ethnic, but then this polyglot, right, workforce in New York? So let's talk about that, some of the challenges, some of the opportunities, and what people did to get around those.
I mean, the IWW made a concerted effort to produce literature in multiple languages. They were notable in that particular regard. The Jews had their own newspaper. I don't know how much they went out of their way to create it.
They did actually, within I was going to say 5 years, but I think it's probably more like a decade. By 1910, there was an Italian language paper which circulated among Italians and which sometimes duplicated the Yiddish language paper. There was no English language paper. That's the key here. There was a Yiddish language newspaper and an Italian language newspaper. And by the 20s, there was even a Spanish language paper. So they did go out of their way to do that. But I wanted to answer the question in a somewhat different way. Sure. That is, instead of solidarity, is it worth looking at the tensions within the union itself, and then how those internal tensions play out outside? Sure. So, when I think about those tensions, I think, for example, about the fact that the American labor movement is not only a skilled craft labor movement, but it is, by and large, in that period, though Samuel Gompers was himself a Jew, he had nothing and didn't want anything to do even with the new Jewish unions that were being formed in that period. And the tension was between the idea that a union should be a combination of skilled workers and the idea that the union was a social institution whose job was to make the world a better place for everybody, starting with the workers. And that ideology, so the Gompers, American trade unionism, you could say that's an American-born model in a way. But the Jewish labor movement model is, you know, your comment that how important the Russian diaspora was, that was a model that came straight out of the Eastern European, came out of the same sort of socialist background that the Bundists came from in the 1880s and 1890s. That is a revolt against capitalism, a revolt against the Tsar, who was then the instrument of capitalism. And that difference, it was an external tension, but it was also an internal tension within the union, because within the Jewish labor movement, there were also, I'm thinking of skilled cutters or fur workers, the skilled elements of the union really wanted to be more like the American labor movement. And the street, especially the women who organized in the union, and we should talk about those in a minute, but especially those, they really wanted, they had a vision of the social unionism that you described. And that was always a tension in the union. It remained a tension exercised through the influence of socialists who didn't join, and the Communist Party, which didn't want to push in certain directions in the 20s and 30s. And in fact, you could argue that that was one of the tensions that, in fact, Sidney Hillman of the Garment Workers Union tried to resolve in the 30s. And, well, there are arguments about how satisfactorily he resolved it, because he became an ally of FDR's and did an awful lot of good, but the union itself, both the Amalgamated and the ILG, had a lot of difficulty accommodating to Sidney Hillman. So I guess that's one tension, but the second tension is, and maybe I should put this on the table now, the gender tension. So the AFL simply didn't organize women workers. It wasn't part of the issue. The Jewish workers, especially the garment workers and the textile workers, needed to organize the women in the shops, because that's, 80% of the workers were female in the garment industry. And the garment industry produced the New York metropolitan area, so including Paterson, produced about 80% of the U.S., of the clothing sold in the U.S. in the early part of the 1900s. I mean, so you're talking about an industry which has, a huge market that they want to keep, and most of whose workers are females. And those females have they certainly have no power at the top at the beginning, and when they slowly begin at the local level, in the locals, to exercise some power, the tensions within the union are explosive. So solidarity, maybe, but the gender tensions, they're reconciled, but I think they exist. They never actually stop existing through the 1930s. I should probably stop talking, but my favorite example of this is Bessie Hillman, who is the wife of Sidney Hillman, in the 1930s decides she's going to organize laundry workers who are majority female, majority black, majority not Jewish, almost no Jews in that industry at the time. And the Amalgamated, of which she is, of course, a vice president, is horrified at this. But the women in the union, the women's locals, are delighted by this. And that doesn't pull the amalgamated apart because she's the wife of the president, so she can get away with it. But that's an example of how those tensions work in the union, not always negatively, sometimes positively.
But that's the institutional labor movement, and that's important,
Yes.
the role of gender there. But there's another level on which that tension exists, and it's important to remember that a good deal of the garment work is done with subcontractors in family systems in which the husbands and men are the bosses of their wives and their children. And
Yeah.
one has to believe that there was substantial amount of tension. That's to say, part of the story is a story of patriarchy and all of
Yeah.
this, and those kinds of tensions that exist. So there's the tension within the family, within the Jewish family, that's gendered. That's a part of the
Yes.
story. We've already spoken of the conflict between bosses and the Jewish bosses and the Jewish working class. And there's a third element, and that's within the Jewish working class. The Bundes who are maybe it's a cultural movement as much as a political movement, and that involves being profoundly secular. And so we need to ask, what's the tension between the Jewish labor movement and Jewish working class and the rabbis? That's to say, the religious community. And then we also need to ask, we know that after 1917, the Jewish Bundes movement divides. There's the Jewish socialists and the Jewish communists. We have the Workmen's Circle, and we have the IWO, and we have Camp Kindering and Camp Kinderland, both located on the same lake. I do folk dancing up there to this day, and they don't talk to one another. You know,
I actually have a husband who's a graduate of Camp Kinderland,
Well, my family
who
too.
talks about how they marched on the Kindering, you know,
Exactly
the
right.
Kinderland kids, you know.
and I had an uncle who brought my parents over, and they were deep friends. They were both involved in the labor movement. They had to agree not to talk about certain kinds of subjects,
Yeah.
because when it came to that divide in 17, one group were the socialists and one group were the communists.
Yes.
That's a profound tension.
I mean, I think that that's actually one of the fascinating pieces of the story, that as the ideological environment, if you like, changes with the Russian Revolution, and socialism now becomes the enemy of communism, and yet there are both socialists and communists within the Union, and depending on who's leading at whichever time it is, that is either a productive relationship or an unproductive relationship, you know, and doesn't get reconciled until the 1930s, when the numbers of people within the Union expand so dramatically that there are enough people to support whatever group you're part of, so you can have all of them, you know, making hay together. But one of the ways in which that tension gets resolved is it's a women's initiative. It's the social tension, not social unionism in the sense that it's you know, concerned with, you know, the lifestyle of the workers and their nutrition and so on, but theater, art, sports teams, literary, folklorists, dance, which you know a lot about. You know, that these elements, these cultural elements, were elements that the women, it was actually, I think, Rose Schneiderman who first said, women want to work for bread, but they want roses too, which became the theme of the Lawrence strike. And Schneiderman, one of the early organizers, then uses this theme, the bread and roses theme, to argue for, you know, it's the women, for example, who push for an educational department in the ILG in 1916. It's Fania Cohn who pushes for that and becomes the first vice president of the ILG, and education is her bailiwick. That's Jewish unionism. That's, you know, it's a way of providing roses or incorporating everybody. You know, we don't stop learning just because we're at the sewing machine. sorry.
So I just want to play a little bit off of something, Alice, that you said, and actually, Tej, I was wondering if you could weigh in on this, because you mentioned the Bolshevik Revolution, but even prior to World War I, right, it has a significant impact on socialists and radicals generally in the U.S. So I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about how some of these external, right, these events or,
The Palmer raids.
Yeah.
How do they affect the Jewish working class or the Jewish labor movement? You're free to jump in with the multiple Red Scares as well.
Sure. No, I think that's really just to pick up on a thread before, from before World War I and go into that Alice is speaking about. I think that bread and roses piece is really useful also because our core question of what is the Jewish labor movement, right. We're disturbing the idea that it's an institutional and bureaucratic thing, right? And we're understanding of it as a movement. Particularly, the aspects that came out of the Bund and Yiddish culture were explicitly in parallel, right? The newspapers, the arts, the recreation, the mutual aid and self-help, the camps, the workers' education, and just to offer a sort of thematic lesson, because a lot of times people look back and they talk about, in contemporary language, identity politics, right? This is a term of the contemporary era. And we have some narratives that say that, identity politics emerged in the 1960s or thereafter. But actually, when we look at this period, it was a robust period of identity politics where, for the Bund, there was this idea, the idea of Deutschheit, right? The idea of here-ness, the idea of Jewish people, working class socialist Jewish people, waging struggle where they are to both maintain their cultural self-determination, but also to be in class struggle, including against Jewish business leaders and Jewish capital in their own industries. And there are parallel stories to other groups, right? I mean, and later when the International Workers' Order emerges, you have that among many ethnic groups over this period, and that's certainly true through the IWW era. But yes, this comes into crisis in the war period, the World War I period, at the height and of U.S. defense production after 1914, and then U.S. combat intervention in 1917. Most clearly, you have a split between the AFL supporting the war effort and supporting a sort of U.S. nationalist incorporation for the American working class, with Samuel Gompers and Woodrow Wilson sort of having a vision of Americanism. But the left divided, right, over the war and over revolution, over what was then a heterodox revolutions that could be anarchist, socialist, syndicalist, communist in Russia, other parts of Eastern Europe, Germany, Italy, Mexico, and elsewhere, and Ireland, for that matter. Yeah. So it wasn't, it was not Stalin just for context. That's not. It was a heterodox and uncertain process that an anarchist like Emma Goldman, a socialist like Eugene Debs, and members of the IWW grappled with. And so this offers two things. It offers a context for wartime and post-war repression. Most acutely in 1919 and 1920, you have the Red Summer of anti-black violence, state and non-state anti-black violence in 1919, of resentment against black self-determination and self-assertion of black workers and black service members. You have the Red Scare of 1919-1920 as those who see them as the keepers of Americanism want to, make America great again and protect it from this foreign influence, which is particularly coded as Jewish in 1919-1920. The idea that the revolutionism in Russia, as well as Germany and Italy and elsewhere, is a Jewish threat to the homeland. And so this involves popular violence and vigilante violence, as well as the Palmer raids led by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, mass deportations. Emma Goldman comes into the crosshairs, a Russian Empire origin anarchist who was very active in this neighborhood. Rose Stokes, who was also an activist in the shirtwaist and other strikes, goes to jail as a leftist who's protesting the war. Eugene Debs, a non-Jewish socialist leader, the most prominent socialist leader, is also jailed. And in that context of repression, the left becomes divided, not just on pro-war, anti-war lines, but on whether they will support the new Bolshevik state or a certain independence or even opposition to it. And by the early 1920s, this will be articulated as socialist versus communist, and that's why you have to have two camps, two Kampkinder, at odds with each other just across the pond from each other in upstate New York in this moment. And so it's a context of both repression, structural repression from pro-business forces and right-wing anti-labor forces and the state, but also an ideological agency, a difference of opinion among left-wing activists where that sort of big tent socialism becomes foreclosed and creates a new context. The IWW is suppressed, and even these left-wing activists, anarchists and socialists, even of the likes of Rose Stokes or Emma Goldman, are not able to operate openly in the early 1920s. And that will echo onward into as fascism becomes a question for the labor left before it becomes a question for official U.S. foreign policy in the 1930s and thereafter.
Thanks for that. We have time really for just one more question from me for quick responses, and that is, what happens to the Jewish labor movement when it moves out of New York City and when workers move out into other occupations? And I'm gonna toss that to you, Cameron, first, and feel free to wedge in any other comments that you want to also if you want to take something from the previous.
So I do appreciate the leeway. You should not give me too much.
Okay, well, we don't have too much, but.
So, to just really briefly to piggyback off of Tej's point, World War I and sort of the ideological schisms of the left, it becomes even more pronounced when from the early part of the 20th century, 1900, 1898, the left sort of formed around the issue of anti-colonialism and opposing the rise of the U.S. empire when the U.S. intervened in the Philippines, in Cuba, and in the minds of many left labor organizations, the obtaining of Hawaii. So the World War I and the Russian Revolution sort of happened at a moment where the left was relatively relatively unified on particular issues and broke apart under the strains of all these different powerful initiatives. But to answer your question,
I got the signal that we have to.
Oh, we got to cut.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, let me. And then, so we'll continue, send your questions up, and there you go. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I had to do that.
It's all right.
Go.
But the West, actually, when we look out west, this process looks a lot different from the push for not just Jewish migrants to actually own land through the Galveston movement when Jewish business when actually encouraged migration to Galveston and then to California, Los Angeles, and the Bay Area. But also, when you look westward, the formation of different alliances with black communities and tensions within black communities look a lot different. Tensions with Asian American groups, particularly Chinese workers, but also Japanese workers and Filipino workers look a lot different. that being said, when we look, when we shift the lens sort of spatially, we sort of look at not necessarily just a Jewish working class movement, but how the Jewish working class influenced other working class movements in the mid-20th century.
I was just going to say, I think maybe it's appropriate to kind of end thinking a little bit about what happens to this Jewish labor movement after the Palmer raids, after from the 20s going over into the 30s. Jews don't continue, still play a major role in the leadership of the garment workers, but they aren't, but second and third generation Jews begin to move into other kinds of places and begin to change their own subjectivity also about how they feel. So that may be worth talking a little bit about.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that the Jewish labor movement, as we've been defining it, gets pulled apart in the 1920s. Its membership drops. The fights between the socialists and the communists are enormous. But one of the things that I find most interesting is that the communists tend to be located in the locals, which tend to be, if not led by women, they're often actually, the secretaries are often male, but the membership and the activity is promoted by women. But the leadership at the top of the union is still all male and non-communist for the most part, and sometimes anti-communist. So the gender struggle is exacerbated in this period, and the union bends over backwards basically to create summer schools and summer programs for men and women, but it is mostly women who take advantage of them. And then as the generation, as their children, the children of the workers, reach maturity and move out of the garment industry because none of them want to take their mother's jobs, they take jobs as teachers and department store workers and social workers, where they also begin to, especially in the 30s, we see become strong advocates of unionization. And you could...
With a legacy to today.
Yeah, with a legacy today. So arguably, you could say that those sort of so-called semi-professional unions were initiated by mostly women who come out of the tradition of the garment workers. So I think that is one of the legacies, and it is down to today. Still, there's not much women's leadership. But
we do have to get to the
Okay.
questions. So
Okay.
I don't know, Tej, do you want to weigh in or?
Yeah, I'll just say, that sort of second generation story is worth telling, right? Thinking of some of these people in that mid-1930s moment who, Rose Peixoto, who goes from the sort of New York City struggle to a more multi-ethnic Latino Los Angeles garment struggle in the 1930s. Dorothy Healy, Elaine Yoneda, other Jewish activists who were involved in multi-ethnic, multiracial agrarian and garment struggles with Black and Latino workers in California in the 30s. And here in New York City, Local 1199, the pharmaceutical and retail union, with prominent Jewish leaders and organizers like Leon Davis and Mo Foner, pioneer this union that is one of the first unions to celebrate Negro History Week and to articulate that they need to sort of give Black workers who are porters, soda workers, stock workers, access to clerk jobs, right, that were Jewish jobs in that segmentation, right, and modeling that social unionism. And they too, 1199, take up the slogan "Bread and Roses" that ILGW and IWW had a generation before. And in parallel, there's a cultural front where writers like Tilly Olson and others, they don't write in Yiddish, they write in English, and they often write a Jewish American second generation story that is Jewish, but also interrelated with other groups too. And this only increases as the war comes by World War II, and as Jewish struggles are seen as linked to black struggles and others.
All right, thanks. I'm going to start reading some questions from the audience. So the first question is, and this is for anyone who would like to answer it, can you talk more about how the anarchist movement fits into the broader picture of the Jewish labor movement?
I could say a little bit about that. Rose Pizzata, which is the American pronunciation of the name, she's a Jewish immigrant from, I think, Belarus. Comes to the U.S. at the age of 19, and right after the war, goes to work in the garment industry and then takes a job. She is an anarchist, and she remains a committed anarchist all her life. In the union, she disguises her anarchism. In other words, she serves on the general executive board. She does not challenge the leadership at all in terms of its ideology. What she does is she challenges it in the sort of small ways in which she organizes. And if I can take a moment to respond to your question, she is one of the organizers who goes out to LA to organize garment workers, and she goes to Puerto Rico to organize them. And here's a bit of the puzzle here. She's organizing in LA. She's organizing workers of Hispanic origin who are Catholic, and she's in the middle of a big strike right before Easter, and all the women want to go back to work because they need the money to buy their children Easter clothes and Easter dresses. And she writes back to the powers that be, and she says, you've got to give me some money. You've got to give me a resource to give these people so that they'll stay out on strike. And you can imagine. So our anarchist, with no support within the union, gets no support from the union for the clothing, and the strike, that particular one, falls apart. And that's a part of what happens to the union, and it needs to adapt and doesn't do it fast enough.
Any other takers for that question about Jewish anarchists?
There aren't. I mean, most of the anarchists move towards the IWW rather than than the Jews do.
It's also tricky because we look back on post-1917 as the emergence of large C communist as something to compare to anarchists. But before 1917, the IWW was a syndicalist organization which contained people who before or after could be called either. So again, in this neighborhood, Emma Goldman is the most prominent and outsized figure, and is connected to the labor struggles. And one thing I would just add is the links to other groups as well. I mean, you have a robust anarchist movement among Mexicans in this generation, amongst Indians, Punjabis, and Bengalis in this generation. So there's a lot of new historical research coming out that looks at both specific groups and the interrelations among these groups. The Ghadar movement among Punjabis and Bengalis in this moment, they have some relationships to Jewish Wobblies in this moment as well. On the West Coast, again, where it's a little bit different. So you have a Jewish Wobbly, Fritz Wolfheim, and an Indian Ghadarite, Har Dayal, that are organizing in the IWW in San Francisco in the 1910s. So those crossings, and with Mexicans too.
And of course, Lawrence and Patterson are both IWW strikes that get a lot of support from the labor movement. So there's a solidarity of recognition, at least, that they're in the same struggle together. And the socialists at that point, the Bundists and the anarchists, see themselves really as a kind of united front against capital.
All right, thank you. Next question, are African Americans organizing in the early 20th century on their own, or what was happening with workers during this period in New York? Cameron mentioned that some of the garment workers were organizing with Jews.
So that is a really big question. I really enjoyed the ambition. But so like African American workers were organizing simultaneously on their own and with assistance from many other groups. This is actually one interesting tension between many African American labor activists and their Jewish counterparts was African Americans oftentimes, in the context of state formation, like anarchy or anarchist movements, and being part of the Communist Party, were a bit more conservative. They were more interested in integrating within the American state rather than sort of like ripping apart and reformulating like the relationships between capital and labor. But African Americans and Jewish labor organizers really kind of did get along in some ways, but in other ways, their goals differed. I would think it's kind of a little bit important to think about it, to sort of think about that in the context of civil rights struggles, that these struggles are not born in the 1960s, 1950s. These go way back to the 1880s. And in these contexts, Black labor organizers have demands that sometimes don't map cleanly onto demands of Jewish organizers, and vice versa. A really interesting example of this is, ironically, in the early 1900s, 1905, 1910, we have a joint movement towards censorship in films by African American activists, film activists, and Jewish film activists. But the terms are kind of different. So Black activists argue that, well, you shouldn't be allowed to display these visceral, violent, racist overtones, like in, say, The Birth of a Nation, because that directly endangers Black people. Jewish activists also argued for censorship, but on a sort of different register. So they didn't really argue about the safety of their own communities. They argued for censorship in a sense that their race was losing a type of cultural capital. And though the censorship laws would actually would kind of not really go through, their demands did intersect, but not really for similar reasons.
It's worth adding to that the Communist Party, which is so active in the 20s and 30s, is also very pro-equality, Black equality. It is the one organization which in those decades really stands up against racism, supports the Scottsboro Boys, becomes active in evictions in Harlem as well as among white people, and just that it's perhaps not in the labor movement, but in the party where that organization happens.
And it's important to remember that the Great Migration coincides really with the period of this massive immigration of Eastern European Jews and Italians. Yet those stories are not integrated well. And you go to Ellis Island and you'll hear nothing about African Americans. The world into which immigrants are arriving, of course, is a world in which they're going to be competing for housing and jobs with all these other kinds of populations who are also desperate for work and for housing. And it's a story that needs to be told much more and integrated and probably researched better.
All right, well, next question. To what extent did the early 20th century American Jewish labor movement concern itself with the emerging Zionist movement? Were they as critical of it as the Bundists?
Yes.
Okay.
They were not Zionists, and indeed the Bundists...
Defiantly not.
Defiantly not, right. In fact, the Bundism was an anti-Zionist movement when it emerged both in Europe and in the United States. The idea being that Jews should reclaim freedom, I guess, in the diaspora, that locking themselves into another place would simply, enslave them in a different kind of way. And the Zionists, of course, are interested in Hebrew and teaching everybody Hebrew. The Bundists are interested in Yiddish. That's Yiddishkeit, the culture of the Jews, is what they want to preserve.
The language of the Jewish street.
The language, thank you. The language of the Jewish street, which was also incidentally women's language. That's the language. So they're interested in promoting literacy, but Zionism was by no means anywhere on their agenda.
It's also worth remembering, at least from my reading of the history, that a disproportionate number of the people who immigrate are the non-religious. That's to say, the deeply religious stay behind. They stay behind. They don't even go in. They don't even go to the industrial cities like Fuj. They stay in the small villages and burrow in. That's where they are. So it's really a disproportionate number of the people who are actually coming are the more secular Jews. It's estimated that probably half the population in New York is secular, or perhaps at most high holy day Jews.
Okay. Do we have time for another question? Okay. All right. Let's see. All right. How about, yes, the ILGWU organized Italian workers, but in a way that wouldn't dilute Jewish control of the union. Please comment on the continued Jewish control of the ILG as the composition of the membership changed.
And, I mean, I could comment on that down to today, right? As the ILG doesn't exist anymore. It's been amalgamated with the amalgamated into Unite and Unite here. I mean, the only thing to say about that is that's right. The Jews organized. They tried to organize, and they were responsive to the cultural backgrounds of everybody they tried to organize, but they did not give up control. There was an Italian seat on the General Executive Board. There were even a couple of African Americans in the post-World War II period on the General Executive Board, but the control was tightly in the hands of the Jewish leadership. I don't think that should surprise us. Every union in the United States, Jewish, not Jewish, whatever, has retained, or, the leadership of that union has tried to retain control for as long as it could, even the good unions. So sadly, if the ILG had actually been willing to give up its leadership, it might have survived in a different kind of way. So, but.
And these sort of left also some lasting cultural scars too, right? With we see as sort of the 20th century moves along, particularly in the late 60s into the 70s, this idea that, these Jewish activists were simply manipulating these populations. They never really wanted to allow agency for say, black people within the union or Italian people within the union. We sort of see a lot of these cultural scarring from this sort of lack of or lack thereof of power struggles within the upper echelon. I think, that being said, though, these arguments over control were really important, but we shouldn't also discount how influential that this organizing actually did have on people's lives on the ground.
I think that's a really good place to say the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.